Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Jenny Dietrich.
Ginny, I need to figure out, what should my title be? I don't really, I
I
feel
like
like I
that.
need to progress some here, and I feel like host just isn't enough. I need
Okay,
more than that.
we can discuss that. Sure.
Okay, right after this. So we all know that it's really, really hard to retain people in agencies, and we want to keep our best talent around. But I don't know about you, but I found employees really are pressing more and more these days to feel like they're continuing to progress, and that
Yep.
means
Yep.
financially, title
Yep.
wise, bonuses, all that kind of stuff. And the conversations that I'm having with agency owners indicate that they're kind of struggling with figuring out how to do this in a meaningful way without just throwing money at the problem or making everybody a vice president or that kind of thing. So I thought that would make for an interesting discussion today. How can we set up some real structure behind the career paths that we give our teams and the way that we compensate them both in title and in money?
Yeah, and I think at the same time, I've had a couple of situations where I've been in the negotiation process with a new employee and they've asked for a title that's way above their pay grade and experience level because they think it's going to look good on their resume. And from my perspective, like I don't care if I make you a VP or senior vice president, like whatever. The challenge that though is that when you leave with that title, you in your mind are going to be demoted because most organizations are not going to give you that same title because it doesn't match your pay and experience. So I think there's a lot of things to think about from that perspective as you're building a comp plan and a career path plan for your employees.
Yeah, and it hurts them externally, which they don't realize, right? When
Right.
they do decide to move on to some other opportunity for that very reason. But it also creates challenges internally when you're not being thoughtful about your title structure across the team, because maybe one person cares more about titles, so they become a vice president, another cares less,
Right.
but you still want
Right.
to reward them financially. And now you've got, someone who's an account manager who's making the same as a vice president or vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It, it,
Yeah.
it just gets really, really messy. And this is something that I think small agencies really struggle with. It's something that I struggled with some of mine because, from my perspective, I just didn't care. You want to take whatever title you want. I,
Yeah.
I, I
Right.
never cared
Right.
about titles.
Right.
The only time I ever thought about a title was in terms of what did it mean externally. Did someone, so for example, when I ran my own business, I wanted to make sure I had a title that was, CEO or president or something like that, so that
Sure.
if I needed to enter into a partnership conversation or something like that, people felt they were speaking at the right level. But I didn't care. You call me an intern, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. It's what I'm doing and what I'm being paid and all that kind of stuff. But some people do care about it. And you do need to be thinking about how do you structure that? And the sooner you think about that in your agency, even when you've only got one or two employees, you need to be thinking about how do you create that kind of career path so that people can advance, and how do you create some uniformity, some salary bands across the business so that you
Yep.
don't have two different account managers making wildly different
Wildly
salaries, because
different.
they'll
Yep.
eventually figure it out.
They yes, they will. You're not supposed to talk about your salary, and yet they do. For me, I'm the same way as you are. Like, I don't care about titles. If you want a content director or content VP or whatever it happens to be, okay, chief content officer, okay. I don't really care. But when this changed for me is when we were working with a client that had a really professional HR team internally, and because part of the work that we were doing with them was internal comms, we had access to all of the work that they did around this, around career path and around salary bands and around compensation and benefits and all of that. And all of a sudden I went, oh, I get it. And I mean, the HR leader, the chief people officer just kept a simple spreadsheet. And it was, okay, if you're in marketing, there's a copywriting job, there's a design job, like she had it broken down. There's an account management job. She had it broken down into all the different spheres. And then across the top, she had, entry level, which was like account coordinator, assistant AE, senior AE, account supervisor, senior account supervisor. Like she had it all the way across. And there was probably 20 years of evolution through all of those titles in each of the segments.
Right.
And then she had the salary bands for each. And, and this was a startup. So whether or not when you got equity and all that kind of stuff. And it was really eye opening for me because I finally realized this, even though I don't care, it's what people need. It's what your employees need, right? People need process. They need structure. They need to understand, if I do these things, I can get promoted to this next level. So just throwing titles out at somebody just because that's what they want is probably not the most effective way to run your business.
Right. And less experienced levels, people like to continue to see themselves progressing on a very regular basis.
Yeah. Every
And
6 months or so.
yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily propose changing everyone's title every 6 months, but you should have something where, every 12 to 18 months, people do have the opportunity to move up, even if it's, not necessarily a huge jump in title, but you should be thinking about using things like senior account manager, right? So now you've got, instead of going from account manager to account executive, you've got senior in the middle there, right? And you could even, my first job was a junior account executive when I started out in the agency world. Now, I'm not a huge fan of using junior in public facing titles because, a lot of times people don't want to talk to someone who they think is junior. So from a client standpoint, that may not be the best thing, but you could always do sort of an internal, you're an account manager right now, you're a junior account manager, business card will say account manager, but you're a junior, sort of like the military does, like in the Navy where you've got, Lieutenant JG, right? So they, the junior grade lieutenant and a regular lieutenant. You still call them lieutenant.
Still call him a lieutenant.
But they're at different grades.
Yep.
And if I've screwed that up, my apologies to my military friends. But anyway, they have those kinds of things.
Something like that, yes.
Right. The rear admiral upper half, rear admiral lower half, right? I mean, they're still a rear admiral. They just have different number of stars on their shoulder. So, those are the kinds of things that you might think about having some internal title differentiation, if you want, in order to continue to show that steady progress to people. And you want to use those titles, as I think we've talked about before. If you're giving someone a meaningful raise, they need to have a title change and responsibility change with it, right? You don't want to have someone who's doing the exact same thing they were doing yesterday, and all of a sudden you're paying them 10%, 15% more. That's not a good message to send. You need to make sure that people understand there's a correlation between your compensation and what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that does, especially if you have it written down and you have it public for everybody, they can say, okay, I see that I'm at this level now, and here are the things I have to do to get to the next level. So they take, most of them, 90%, 95%, take responsibility for that, right? So they'll say, okay, I need to do professional development in this. I need to make sure that I have access to clients that do this. I need to do this, this, and this. And they'll take responsibility for learning those new skills to be able to be promoted. And they will also take responsibility to come to you and say, hey, I think I'm ready, and here's why. And that's the kind of motivation you want to provide employees, because that will give them the opportunity to be in charge, sort of control their own destiny inside your agency.
Yep. And you have a lot more flexibility with these titles than you think you do, right? I mean, one of the things I talk with agency owners about a lot is that you can get pretty creative with your title structures so that you have more and more steps that people can move through. So you can have account managers, account executives, as we talked about, having senior portions of those, but you can be, an account director, a director of accounts, a director of public relations. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that you can do so that you're able to continue to hand out progressively, I would say different, not necessarily even better, right? Because there are some agencies where an account manager is senior to an account executive, and I've seen the opposite too, right? I mean, a lot of it depends on where someone started and what the convention was at their first agency, and then they carry that forward when they have their own agency. But there's no magic to this. It's one of the reasons why you have to be careful when you look at salary benchmarks across agencies. Right? It's not just that they're in different locations and have totally different business models. It's that an account manager in one is not the same as an account manager in another in many cases.
Yeah, and I think so. I would do a few things. I would definitely look at salary surveys to understand what's out there. Not just from a location and an industry perspective, but also from an experience perspective, and create it for your own agency. For us, I actually took, when I worked for Fleischman Hillard, it was very clear. You knew exactly, and they had a really wide range of titles, and so I implemented that in my own agency. So to your point, there are probably 3 or 4 levels within one group. So an account executive, an account manager, an account supervisor, like managing supervisor. You have 3 or 4 levels inside there, each of those, so that you progress along that. So it's really just about thinking about how you want to do it. To your point earlier, if you don't want to have junior in the title externally, what does that look like, internally, and how do you discuss that with your employees? So, but it's not, this is probably one of the easier things you can do as an agency owner is create that spreadsheet, understand what those titles are, what the salary bands are, and how quickly you think people might move. Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? Is it 18 months? Is it 24 months? And set those expectations. And now you have it so that everybody's on, sort of singing from the same hymn book.
Yeah, and not only that, but it also helps to protect you from title inflation, which is a problem not just from a compensation
Yeah,
standpoint,
yeah, yeah.
but it's also a problem as you grow, because if you're scaling up, you may want to bring in some higher level talent. And if you're going to do that, they're going to need to come in with a higher title than the people that are going to be reporting to them or
Mm-hmm.
being junior to them otherwise. And so, if you have too much title inflation and you've got someone with 3 years of experience who's a vice president, well, now what are you going to do when you want to bring in someone who's got 10 years of experience,
Right.
right? Even senior VP is probably not enough of a bump over someone that they've got 3 times the amount of experience of. And so you want to make sure that you're being cautious about that, and be really careful about anything where it makes someone sounds like they are in charge of something overall, right?
Right.
So, be really careful with C-level titles. I've seen some folks
Yes.
who want to add,
Yes.
I'm going to make this person my chief operating officer. Well, but they were your assistant 2 years ago. Yeah, but they're really detail oriented. Cool.
Cool.
Great. Make them a director of operations or something
Right.
like that. Something
Right.
where you can
Yes.
easily layer them
Yes.
if you get to the point where you need to do that, because it's really difficult once you've got a COO to find a title that is more senior than COO without giving up your own. So you want to be thinking about those kinds of things, and the sooner you think about them, the better. Because I've seen agencies go through trying to fix their title structures and fix their salary bands, and it is really, really
Yeah.
painful,
Yeah.
because you can't really demote somebody, but ultimately, if you've got someone who's being overpaid for the role that they're in, or they're overtitled for the position that they're in, it creates tension with the rest of the team as you grow. So solve this when you're at those 1 or 2 employee levels, and not when you're at 20 or 30.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too, because when you're at the 1 to 5 to 10 employees, you're like, yeah, sure, I'll make this person the chief operating officer. I'll make this person the chief client services director. I'll make this person the chief marketing officer, this person the chief content officer, whatever it happens to be. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of people who A, should not be C-suite, B, should not be on your leadership team, and C, don't have the experience of that title. So that when you start to grow, all of a sudden you're like, oh, this person I want to hire is actually a really experienced chief content officer, but I can't bring them in at that because I already have one. So
Right.
really be really thoughtful about those kinds of things.
Right. Give yourself that wiggle room, and like I said, make sure that you're matching up the titles with the salary bands, so that if
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
employees talk and they're both account managers, they're being paid similarly. And
Yes.
you don't want one where one's getting 25% more than the other. If you're going to pay someone 25% more, move them up to a different title band
Yep.
that corresponds with that. So when you're putting together your list of titles for your agency, make sure that they have salary bands next to them, so that you can always deviate slightly out of them, but try to stay as tight to those as possible, because it will keep you out of trouble. It will make sure that you're having fairness and equity across your team, and it will also put you in a position where you're more ready to grow and scale as the time comes.
And I will tell you that if you grow to a point where you need either a fractional HR person, or you hire an HR person, or you have an outsourced HR organization, they're going to make you go through that process. And
Yes.
they're going to make you look at everything and say, okay, are these people being paid fairly and the same? Are they within that same salary band? And the client I mentioned earlier, one of my personal jobs with the chief people officer was to do that work, to figure out. And what we discovered is that in this organization at the time, this was 5 years ago, that women and people of color were not paid the same as white men, and title notwithstanding. And so what we set to work to do was to correct that. And she was great. She was really good to work with, because she taught me a lot about running my own business from that perspective. But she was like, listen, in some cases, we're going to have to give these women or people of color a title jump because we have to get them within that same salary range. And it took a couple of years of really strategic planning to get people where they needed to be. But that was her sole job for 2.5 years, was to do that. So that they will require that you do that. So just make it easier on yourself now, because otherwise it's going to cost you a lot of money later. A lot.
Well, and to that point, I think, if you are being consistent with matching up salary bands to titles, it makes it easier for you to spot where you may be being unfair and
Love
not
that.
being
Yep.
consistent,
Yep.
right? Because
Yep.
a lot of times you forget what someone's salary is, except
Yep.
when you sit down and I mean, I
Yep.
know that after I had, more than 2 or 3 employees, I often had to look up on a spreadsheet to see, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what am I actually paying them? Because I don't know it off the top of my head, and I wouldn't
Sure.
expect most agency owners to know that. But when you see their title on a daily basis, you can sit there and say, should Sally really be paid more than Dave? Because you know that their titles are different. And so that helps you to see it in a way that you wouldn't if you had to go back to a spreadsheet to figure out, am I paying them 50 or 55 or 60?
Yep. Yep.
Somewhere in that
Yep.
general ballpark, but I can't remember when I last gave them a rate. I mean,
Yep.
it's just natural. But if you're being consistent with your titles, then you can figure out, okay, these folks are really the same. They should be at the same title level, or Sally's much better. Sally should have a more senior title, which means she should be paid more. And so the more that you're thinking about that, I think the more it helps to achieve your goals that most agencies I know have when it comes to equity amongst the employees.
Yeah, for sure. I actually think it's a fun exercise, but it's definitely an exercise that you need to do. And like I said, just put your buckets on the left-hand side of a spreadsheet, put all the titles that you can think across the top, and then start to break it down. And I love spreadsheets, so it may be more fun for me than it might be for some of our listeners, but it will give you a really good place to start, and then you can start to fill things in as you hire people.
Right. Because if you're not doing this, then you're going to end up with people who are completely out of whack from either a compensation or a title standpoint. You're going to make it too difficult to retain staff because you're not going to be able to show them that steady progression, because you sit there and say, well, I can't make you a VP and I've topped out. No, you've now got a spreadsheet with a list of like 30 options of different titles. And I'm not kidding. There could be at least 30 options on that.
That's right.
Spreadsheet, so that you can cover someone throughout the entirety of their career, from straight out of college all the way on to, they're about to hit retirement. Why not? There's no reason why you can't have that kind of progression available to you.
Yeah.
And it's really
fun.
not that
it's
difficult
kind of
to do. Yeah, it can be kind of fun to think about, what exists out there, what might work for you in the future, and dream about having that team of 20, 30, 40 people, where the titles actually make a bigger difference in how everybody interacts with each other.
Right.
So think about all these things, because you got to have these tools available to you.
And as an aside, if you're on video, I'm in my car office today, which is why this looks strange.
Yes, I would encourage you to check out the video, even if you don't watch it regularly, because
Lots of cars drive by.
Cars driving by. Ginny's sitting here with her sunglasses on.
Sunny out. Yep.
She does not usually do in her home office.
No, I don't. No.
Which is good, because that would be a little bit weird if you did.
I mean, I can, but
the hamster's weird enough. I don't think we need sunglasses too. So.
All right. Well, if you change your mind, I can definitely make that happen.
In any case, I don't want you to get a parking ticket, so we probably should draw this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast to a close, so that you can feed the meter, move along, whatever it takes to avoid the meter maids of Chicago. So with that, I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Ginny Dietrich.
And it depends.